Welcome everybody. I'm joined by Dr. Brian Moretta from Hardman & Co. Brian, good to see you again. Now we've got some sort of new viewers for some of these programs. So for people who are not familiar, tell us about Hardman, tell us about yourself.
So Hardman & Co. is a company that was established over 20 years ago as an equity research house. And the reason why I'm here today is because we got involved in sort of tax advantages side of things about 3 or 4 years ago. Personally, my background is I started work as a trainee actuary, went back to university, did a PhD in network theory. I then went out, decided academia wasn't for me, became a fund manager for 11 years. And since then, I had a sort of kind of break and I did a little bit of consulting for private equity and miscellaneous projects. And I've been with Hardman for 6.5, nearly 7 years.
Now you spend a lot of your time sort of digging into a lot of the sort of tax efficient products, and today we're going to sort of talk about a report that you've got out at the moment about business relief, with the title I love, The Truth About What's Underneath, which kind of sounds sort of slightly ominous, but I mean just again, for our audience is relatively new, just explain a bit about business relief. It's been around actually for quite a long time. Originally it was called business property relief. It's kind of morphed. What's the sector about? Why is it important?
So business relief as a concept has been around since the 1970s. And it hasn't really seen a lot of adjustments, unlike the EIS sort of side of things. There is a slight grey area in that it's only ever granted on exit rather than entry, which EIS, VCTs, etc. are. And obviously we have an issue in the country at the moment for people who previously were not being caught by inheritance tax, now are. Rising profit prices obviously a primary part of that, but also general accumulation of assets in other ways, reduction of interest. Reduction of pension allowances means there's more assets sitting outside pension schemes as well. So all that means that there is a greater interest in relieving inheritance tax. And business relief is a very easy way of doing that. It's not perfect. There's several ways of mitigating inheritance tax, none of which are perfect. Different ones suit different people. But business relief is definitely a candidate for a lot of people.
So for advisors, this whole sector about advising clients, families on inheritance tax is clearly going to be a massive issue going forward. We're in this huge sort of generational sort of hand down of wealth, aren't we, over the next sort of 10 to 20 years?
Absolutely. I think we're already starting to see that. We've seen the inheritance tax take go up. Statistics keep showing that's growing, despite the increase in allowances. And as people become more aware of that, and we have a generation that perhaps slightly bigger, equivalent to the American baby boomers, which is kind of getting to that point where they're starting to accept their own mortality and think about, well, what's happens and how do I pass my assets on to my children or whoever else in the most tax efficient way I can.
And of course, as we know with financial services, when there's an opportunity there, suddenly there's a wave of products. In the last couple of years, I think it would be fair to say there's been a proliferation of providers offering IHT-based solutions. A lot of them, offering around sort of business relief, and that's the kind of the nub of kind of what you're looking at in the report.
Absolutely.
Isn't it?
So they're kind of divided into two categories. You've got the AIM quoted products or portfolio services, which we don't really look at this report, and we get the unquoted non-AIM ones, which we do. And they, as you say, it's really maybe over the last 5 years. I think you've got quite a few of these products have only been around for that sort of length of time, some less. There's a handful that have been around longer and have much very deeper track records.
And before we dig into the sort of report, just so again for people who are not particularly familiar, I mean, as you say, a lot of AIM shares, but not all qualify for business relief.
Absolutely. So there's restrictions essentially about you can't be an investment company. Be that in shares, in property, or similar. And there's some other minor restrictions as well. So in AIM, there's probably 10% of AIM is instantly disqualified because you can sort of see, okay, this is an investment company, really. There's another sort of category of companies where there's a grey area where they might be sitting on a lot of cash, or it's not entirely clear. but there's a large chunk that probably do. There's also, you've got a lot of small companies with liquidity issues, and they are things that people might think twice about for business relief. So it's not a straightforward, and there's also there's high risk areas.
Yeah.
If you're thinking about business relief, you're probably thinking about capital preservation, and investing in a handful of biotech companies may not achieve the investment objectives that you're looking for.
Exactly. And as you say, your report, again, the truth about what's underneath, is about the non-AIM based sort of offerings out there. So again, is it possible to generalise, categorise those? Do they break down in sort of certain types?
So you've got a variety of trades, as people call them, where so the two biggest areas are lending of various descriptions. So primarily property lending, residential development, bridging loans, some commercial property development, some infrastructure loans, as they call, which is energy assets. And then you have energy assets, which is actually slightly more is into energy assets, primarily solar and wind, but you also have anaerobic digestion, which has been a subject of some discussion over the last few months. You have biomass, you have some hydro, so there's a variety of things. And then you've got some other miscellaneous things as well. So there's a few schemes invest in forestry, you've got some do leasing, so it covers a broad church of I think it'd be fair to say. So again, for advisors who are not particularly familiar, I know you dig into it in the sort of the report, and the report is free to advisors, isn't it? And so again, what are the sort of some of the areas that people should be looking out for when they're trying to look at a scheme on behalf of a client? So one of the issues in the sector is transparency is limited. And this is why we sort of about what's underneath. It's pretty clear that a lot of the schemes do not go out of their way to make themselves transparent. I'm not saying they're deliberately hiding stuff. The one or two, when you look underneath, you might wonder if they are. I think, so understanding what the risks are in terms of these are marketed as very low risk products. And a lot of them are not low risk, and certainly not no risk, which I think the way that's sometimes interpreted. There are very much risks in there, and we try and sort of look underneath to sort of say, well, actually, where's the risks? How are these things performing? I think one of the things I keep looking at is that we've been in an environment, certainly if you look at lending and property, we've been in an environment for the last few years that's been very positive for these. Lending should not have been giving much in the way of defaults, and generally speaking, it hasn't. We've been very benign. We've had a combination of secular and cyclical decline in interest rates, increasing institutional acceptance of solar and wind assets as proper vehicles for institutional investment. The prices of those yields have come down, and the prices of those have gone up. So those have been very good areas to be invested in. Probably, if you look forward, these things probably aren't going to get better. And certainly on the lending, there's a risk that they might get worse, where you might get more bad debts. Yet these products have only delivered in line with their targets. Now you would say, given the environment, that they should be doing better generally. So where is that excess return going? And I think that's one of the key questions we ask, because if you understand that, you might understand what's going to happen when things aren't going quite so well.
And when you're looking at the risk, is it as simple as saying an area like anaerobic digestion, which is relatively small, is more risky than forestry, for example? Can you make that sort of kind of binary analysis?
Sometimes you can. So there are some things where you can sort of say I think sometimes lending is a bit easier, where you can sort of see what people are lending on, and you can have a feeling for what's going on. So there's a mezzanine lender out there who's a business relief product who are clearly at the riskier end of things, and they've got a higher target return, to be fair. Sometimes it's a bit harder. The easiest way to sort of summarize this in one sense is to say, what's the growth return that they're getting on their assets? Now this is not easy to get to. because of things like disclosure and accounts. A lot of companies produce abbreviated accounts, sometimes at the parent company level, a lot of times at subsidiary level, where so trying to dig into what the actual returns are, and the difference between the return and the gross return and the net return, if you like, gives you an idea of what's being eaten up in expenses, costs, etc. But the gross return is going to be very much more closely related to the risk, the underlying risk, than the net. And this raises questions about things like gearing, where gearing is clearly potentially a risk increasing thing and should be delivering a better return. But most of the geared products are delivering the same sort of target returns as things that are doing equivalent assets and ungeared. And that's a question advisors need to be aware of, or an issue they need to be aware of, and a question that you can answer is, if they're investing in a geared product, is it providing better things in other aspects than the ungeared products? If they can't answer that, they shouldn't do it.
And I think leading on from that, there's the obvious question about the transparency of fees, which I think is probably one of the areas that you look at in the report.
Absolutely. But managers have become better on fees, I think. Let's be fair to everybody. Fees have both become a bit more transparent and are coming down a little bit. I mean, they're still higher possibly in other product areas.
Are they becoming more standardised across sectors, do you think?
I think we're seeing a bit more. We probably are. So what we've seen a move towards is some sort of service charge, a fixed service charge, and then there's an annual management charge on top of that, which is generally contingent on achieving the target return. That has become increasingly common. I wouldn't say it's the standard, but I think that's what people seem to be moving towards at the moment, and that's probably not a terrible thing. There's different ways of how you make that annual charge conditional, and some people have made it complicated and some people made it simple. But there's still some things that are not clear, where it's not exactly clear how much is being charged, the expenses that come through the company itself, and who's paying for what. The accounts often do net consolidations, which means you can't see what's happening in the underlying thing. You just get the net profit figure or the net balance sheet figure, rather than saying, well, what's actually being paid out in expenses.
So I guess, would it be fair to say that the risk to advisors with some of these sort of products is that, while they may maintain the capital as the advisor hopes on behalf of his or her client, that actually, when we get to the end of the sort of product cycle, the kind of final outcome is not perhaps quite as they kind of expected, particularly if, unfortunately the client has sort of passed away, so it's this kind of next generation who are picking up the affairs. It's not quite, that £100 is actually worth a bit less than they thought it was going to be type scenario.
Yeah, well, certainly that's got to be a risk. Certainly, I mean, we mentioned Oxford Capital earlier, and I don't think anyone in the sector can ignore what has happened there. And while Oxford Capital have been very good at keeping the information to themselves, it's clear that while the whole fund has not become valueless, some companies in there appear to have been wiped out by what happened. So there's clearly risks in there, and you need to be aware of, at the end of the day, if interest rates go up, which right now the prospects for the next couple of years maybe don't look that strong, but if interest rates went up sharply, energy assets will fall in price. And that could affect the capital. And if you're geared, it's going to affect your capital more than if you're in something that's ungeared.
And just finally, for advisors who are new to this, they're looking at the sector, other than reading your report, clearly, what are the sort of one or two tips? What would you say? You've got to look at these, understand these elements of a product before you consider taking it further.
I come back to the gross and net return. Understand there's a net return, which is their target, but understand what the gross return is. Simplistic terms, look a bit at the governance as well. Governance of the sector leaves something to be desired. I think I compare it with the investment company sector. And 20 years ago, they went through this, okay, we need independent directors, and the sector is It's not as bad perhaps as investment companies, but there's a lot of companies out there with no independent directors, no external oversight, it would seem, at all. And I think we need to get things better.
Lovely. Brian, thank you very much. So last plug, the report, the truth about what's underneath. And I think email address, is vp@hardmanandco.co.uk.
Yes, that will go to my colleague Vilma. If you're interested in panel services or we're looking at consultancy service for individual cases, we'll be happy to speak to you about that.
Excellent. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.